Hey, Cypher here. Andy from Atun Shei Films directed a horror movie, and it's actually pretty awesome. It's called The Sudbury Devil, and he's distributing it himself, so I'll link to how to get it below. Something that's great about the horror genre is that it can highlight societal fears and act as a cultural symbol of that. The Sudbury Devil does that well, with the added layer of some very interesting historical literacy. It uses the theme of scars from the past affecting how New England conquered its frontier. By extension, it's a commentary on settler colonialism and the puritanical religiosity that came with it.
Get thee behind me, Satan! Thou art an offense unto me!
Though it had a minuscule budget, Andy used everything he could to make a fun, sadistic, and raunchy flick that reflects back what we all know. So let's thoroughly interrogate The Sudbury Devil, both its setting and meaning. This is a fictional film, but it is clearly meant to invoke a lot of history, which lends it profundity, even amongst the gory violence and fornication. Which, by the way, I must forewarn anyone watching the movie, yeah, there's a ton of gratuitous sex. What do you know about gratuitous sex? You don't even have balls. When I saw it in the theater, there were folks who straight up walked out because they were offended by the debauchery. So you should know what you're in for beforehand. Also, Andy and I know each other, so obviously I've got a fair amount of bias in his favor. Nonetheless, it's a worthwhile movie to check out. Finally, I'll let y'all know when I get to spoilery territory in this review. But first, let's look at the broader context this movie takes place in. It'll be a while before we get to spoilers. The Sudbury Devil takes place a few years after King Philip's War. That nominally ended in 1676, once rangers hunted down the titular King Philip, or Metacom, chief of the Poconokeets. Wabanakis continued the fight in the north for a couple years, and they actually achieved a Pyrrhic victory. For the tribes in the territory Massachusetts colony claimed, including Nipmucks, they lost badly. Metacom's allies had initially set the English frontier back at the beginning of the war, raiding and massacring several towns, making settlers fear annihilation. One of those towns was Sudbury, where this film takes place. That's why the characters repeatedly refer to this past trauma.
Savages beset the town. Militia was not to be found all morning. We was forced to take up arms for the defense.
Now Englishmen hunted Indians down with a vengeance to remove them everywhere, even if they were in praying towns, where their Christianization was supposed to ensure they'd be viewed as civilized. Many got deported to islands, such as Deer Island, where over 1,000 were interned for winter. It set the standoffish relationship colonists maintained with tribes and pushed the frontier further inland. This ongoing terrorizing is what historian Peter Silver calls a kind of counter-fear, one equal and opposed to the boundless terrors that Europeans felt. That fear reverberated back on the settlers themselves. Massachusetts colony was highly puritanical at this point, absolutely refusing religious freedom and preventing those viewed as impure from holding office within the charter. After the near fiasco of King Philip's War, the English crown attempted to interfere and would eventually conglomerate all the various colonies into an extremely controversial dominion in 1686, which quickly fell apart after a revolution in England deposed King James II, mostly for being Catholic. His predecessor, Charles II, had made several attempts at religious tolerance, even converting to Catholicism on his deathbed in 1685 after lapsing into absolutism. Puritans believed that the Pope was either the Antichrist or some other form of evil idolatry, and therefore not Christian, a form of anti-Catholic zealotry that persists today. So from 1676 to 1691, tensions were high between the nominally Catholic monarch and his Protestant colonists overseas, resulting in religiously motivated crackdowns to maintain the purity of the population. On top of that, the first of many intercolonial wars began in 1688, involving the French and English colonies alongside various allied tribes. This was King William's War, the New World counterpart to the European War of the Grand Alliance. This was just the first of many French and Indian wars, which would ultimately end in 1764, long after this movie depicts. Puritans saw France as a Catholic kingdom, so they felt embattled in their faith. The most famous of these crackdowns to maintain purity came a year after the dissolution of the Dominion of New England in Salem, Massachusetts. The first accusation of witchcraft there led to a hunt for heathens among their settlements, with over 200 people arrested, 5 of whom would die in jail, 30 found guilty, 18 executed, and 1 man pressed to death with rocks while refusing to confess. Historian Emerson Baker points out the connection between this and King Philip's War when he argues that the first accused had been uprooted by the war, had lost family members to the conflict, and had their homes destroyed. Some of them may have been suffering from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress syndrome. A prominent Puritan at the time, Cotton Mather, notes what one of the girls saw. There exhibited himself unto her a devil having the figure of a short and black man. He was not of a Negro, but of a tawny or Indian color. This indicates the nightmares that supposedly possessed her and their source, as in King Philip's War. But that is likely long after the time this movie depicts. Nonetheless, witch hunts weren't a new thing to the colonists in 1692. The first New England settler executed for witchcraft was Alice Young in 1647. Connecticut convicted her daughter a few decades later, but like the majority of supposed witches, she wasn't executed like her mother. At least 12 women and 2 men were executed before the Salem witch trials. Ultimately, witch hunts were a way to maintain public morals by shaming people to keep them in line. Crucially, Puritans saw Indians as a corrupting influence. They compared the wilderness and so-called savages that inhabited it with devilry. Mather vociferously connected witchcraft and Indians. He wrote, "The story of the prodigious war made by the spirits of the invisible world upon the people of New England in the year 1692 hath entertained a great part of the English world with a just astonishment, and I have met with some strange things, not here to me mentioned, which have made me often think that this inexplicable war might have some of its origin among the Indians, whose chief sagamores are well known unto some of our captives to have been horrid sorcerers, and hellish conjurers, and such as conversed with demons." Puritans saw the land as corrupted with these savage ways, and in need of purification through active vigilance against any slippage towards Satan. Many even associated signing agreements with indigenous people to buy land as putting their name in the devil's book, lending yet another excuse to conquer land. Sudbury was certainly part of this trend. They made a similar connection to slaves. English colonists kept many Indian slaves in the 17th century, but the practice began to fade as captive transfers became a common bargaining tool after King Philip's War. They turned to chattel from across the Atlantic instead. Massachusetts had been the first to legalize African slavery in 1640. Upper-class settlers often had servants of their indentured or enslaved people, so Africans were a known and marginalized sight throughout New England. Hence, why they too became associated with witchcraft. Historian Richard Slotkin writes, "The Indians, and perhaps the Negro slaves as well, were seen as most closely related to the spirit of the place in America, but they became more and more strongly associated with devils, cannibals, and witches." These associations further justified the dispossession and subjugation wrought upon Indians and Africans, regenerating English and later American society through violence, the essential frontier myth according to Slotkin. It is in this heady mix of legacy, fear, and conquest that the movie takes place. Many characters are physically scarred by the war.
I came still by this wound.
Damned heathens. They're in the war.
Ah. Where?
In the Sudbury fight.
Bloody Brook. Athwart the Nipmuc. Savage took me eye.
They acknowledge that they are on former Nipmuc land, and that it needs cleansing.
Whose country was this ere the war?
The Nipmuc, sir.
It belonged not to the Indians. They dwelt here only by the grace of he who is their landlord and their father. The savages are gone. The devil remains.
Night falls hard here, sirs, and with it comes a most dreadful dark, and a most heavy silence.
The war against the devil is waged within men's hearts.
Two magistrates from Boston go out to Sudbury to investigate a sighting of a spirit.
A spirit? It came in the form of light. This is the place. It was there.
They run into a slave enacting their worst fears of devilry.
By the rod, she's a wild beast!
So it is with those of the African race. Prodigious of body, slow of mind.
And you can see the growing bigotry of the time when they say,
There's a mark set upon that people.
Not rule is the general, but hath its exception. We hath both known clever Indians.
They carve faces from wood. Whilst we straddle the oceans, spreading the knowledge of Christ.
And no, that doesn't mean color racialization has always existed. In fact, Andy specifically acknowledges this in his commentary.
Most of the dialogue in this scene is taken word for word from this book, but white supremacy as like a scientific, religious, and ideological philosophy hadn't quite coalesced yet. The modern social construct of race, of course, having formed to provide a cogent justification for the predatory exploitation of slavery and colonialism.
This is about rising racism of that time. So we can see here that the movie is setting up a particular horror premise, that of violence revisited upon its perpetrators, revealing its ingloriousness and whether love or vengeance is the best way to address that atrocious history. In order to explain that, I'm going to have to get into spoilers from here onward. So if you haven't seen it yet, go watch it, cause it's fun. You now know the setting and everything, so you'll get a lot more out of it. The twists and layers of this film are great, and I'm about to ruin them. You've been warned. Spoilers commence in 3, 2, 1. So the two magistrates have been lured into a trap by a coven of witches run by this woman, who happens to be a spurned wife of one of the men killed during the war. Her name is Patience, and her scar came from her husband slashing her, but it will have much more significance later. She's determined to bring Satan into the world.
The Christian God was the worst calamity that ever befell this country.
They keep referring to Lucifer.
The day star cometh, and he hath chosen us to aid his passage into this world.
Patience's name signifies her willingness to wait and complete her task. First, they attempt to birth Satan through an act of love, or at least what one of the magistrates calls fornication.
Thou wilt be charged with the crime of fornication.
But that fails, so they instead choose vengeance.
'Tis not love that will bring the day star into the world, 'tis hate. Vengeance.
Luring another victim in, while Patience is disguised as her husband, they get in a massive bloody fight, and this time are successful. A cursory viewing would see this as just a slasher movie, but its historical setting and that vengeance they speak of is a way to interrogate this further and draw out its meaning. Fletcher, the former ranger here, turns out to not have fought as gloriously as people thought.
Dragged from the 6 oak floors of Boston Harbour public houses, and pressed into service, under a mad rogue, for whom murder was a pleasure. 'Twas no fight, it was a massacre. For there are Canadians who will pay 3 English pounds for an Indian head, and children's heads are lighter.
Yet settlers refuse to accept that an Englishman would commit such an atrocity.
This is Quaker talk.
revealing how self-righteous Puritans were even when faced with their own wrongdoing.
'Tis the Indian savages that commit such barbarous acts, not Englishmen.
Patience uses Fletcher's reticence to enact her scheme.
All New England may raise a cup for thee, but thy conscience knows better.
First, he helps her through love, but when that's insufficient, he helps through vengeance. As the final fight persists, we see the other men slashing Patience to symbolize how brutality harms all of society, especially among those gendered as weaker, and everyone is implicated in it. Violence is ultimately revisited upon its perpetrators. The devil in this is the manifestation of their wrongdoing. That's why at the end, Fletcher makes a final request to Satan.
All thy long life, make the folk of Sudbury suffer. Torment the people of New England by the devil. That we're so rich, lady, there.
New England was founded on murderous dispossession, just as all settler colonial states. It enriched the imperial seat of power in Old England and bears the markings of that past. We're reminded several times in the film of this when we see pictures of modern Boston, with subways, trains, and even the Prudential Tower. An interesting interpretation you can glean from this is about repeating the past and learning from our mistakes. To bring in another victim, much of the first sequence is repeated. The supernatural elements show up as Satan draws nearer to birth. Interestingly, there were some similar phenomena reported during colonial times.
Strange weather he be having.
Mather himself had published a book called Wonders of the Invisible World that blamed a number of reported incidents of lights and strange clouds on devilry. Really seems like anything that he disliked or confused him was the work of Satan. Brings new meaning to bedeviled. These dark premonitions in the movie represent a rejection of triumphalism. Triumphal narratives have long plagued the history profession, where the winning of the West was always good and atrocities went unremarked upon. This movie is a vehement denial of those erasures. In New England, Christianity defined conquest, so the devil is explicitly in opposition to it.
Hail, Satan.
There's a lot of layers to this film. It's fun as hell, and there's a lot to examine. Andy did amazingly well on such a small budget. So if you haven't seen it despite that spoiler warning, go ahead and do so. I've linked to Atun Shei's distribution below in the description. I hope that this is an indicator of more to come, for the devil never sleeps.
Hey, look who came up here. Look who came up here. You guys right there. Well, thank you. He's a good boy. Mwah. Mwah. No, don't do that. Meow. Meow. Where's your tail, Poofy? Come here. Where's your tail, Poofy, huh? You guys can't see it, but his tail's all poofy for some reason. Well, thank you. King, hey. That's my tripod. Both it... Meow. Meh. What? What? You complain, you get picked up. Damn's the rules.